Ilana Gershon. I'm an anthropologist at Indiana University. I used to study how people use new media to break up with each other, which was a topic that I really liked talking about because I often felt like a stand-up comedian. And then I am now switching to studying how people use new media in the process of hiring, but I'm really interested in hiring. And it turns out, we'll find out whether this happens, the few times that I've given talks about this, everybody gets really depressed. There's this kind of quiet glumness in the room. So I'm going to try my best to prevent that. So today I want to talk about the advice that people get about how to use LinkedIn, which is so central right now for how people are thinking about hiring. Now, I'm interested in the advice that surrounds LinkedIn for a couple of reasons. So first of all, LinkedIn is one of the most boring social media that I have ever had to interview anybody about, right? I'm not saying that LinkedIn itself is boring. I'm saying that talking to people about how they use LinkedIn makes my eyes glaze over, and it turns out makes their eyes glaze over too. Okay, so since talking about what people actually do on LinkedIn is pretty mind-numbing, and I like and respect all of you too much to turn this into the focus of my talk, so what I'm trying to do is think about what is really interesting about LinkedIn. And it turns out that the conundrums that people trying to figure out how to adopt LinkedIn, the conundrums that they have is actually pretty fascinating. So, for example, at the end of all of my interviews with job seekers, I always want to know if they have any questions for me, right? Like if having done all this research, if they'd be interested in anything that I found. And they often ask, yeah, I do have a question for you. What is LinkedIn good for? Or they'll say, how do I use LinkedIn? And I get so confused. But you just told me how you use LinkedIn. And they say, I know, but how do you really use it? Now, I have to say, no one has ever asked me, how do you really use Facebook or Twitter or Instagram? And so what I want to do is I want to talk about why LinkedIn in particular is the kind of media that inspires this question. Now, the last reason that I'm interested in the advice that surrounds LinkedIn is I'm also interested in how standardized practices emerge around new media in different ways under different forms of capitalism. Now, some of you may be in the same kind of academic space that I'm in, where people are constantly mentioning neoliberalism, and I never know what they actually mean when they say neoliberalism. And there are a number of ways to deal with that, right? Sometimes you can just say, okay, this is just a kind of buzzword that I'm just going to hear and not deal with. But for some reason, neoliberalism kind of made me want to know what precisely is it, and try to figure out a way to think about it more rigorously. So part of what I want to do today is find a way to engage with neoliberalism with a little bit more of historical precision by comparing neoliberal forms of standardization with Fordist forms of standardization. Now, in particular, what I'm interested in is figuring out whether standardization emerges in historically specific ways so that in the moments when standards are emerging, that there are different ways of organizing markets, and do they encourage different techniques for standardizing practices? Do they focus on different practices? Do they inspire different types of actors to be involved in the process of standardizing? What is the difference between a telephone operator versus a content manager? And does it foster attempts at standardization at different moments in people's use and adoption of new media? So the first part of my talk is going to be about laying this out in greater detail. Now, I could mention theorists that I'm arguing with right now, like Benedict Anderson, but I thought it might be more fun to give you an example from Seinfeld that kind of captures exactly what I'm arguing with. So in a sense, my argument is expressing my great skepticism with a Seinfeld episode, The Pledge Drive, in which everyone in New York suddenly starts eating candy bars, cookies, and donuts with a knife and fork. So what I'm saying is that I really just don't believe that etiquette spontaneously becomes widespread, even with class privilege behind it in the way that it is in the Seinfeld. But I'm also saying I'm also saying that etiquette around new technology emerges in different ways under Fordism than it does under neoliberalism. So when scholars of capitalism tend to talk about Fordism or Taylorism, which might sound familiar to you, they're talking about the assembly line efficiency that means that craft was no longer involved in manufacturing. The labor of the mind and the labor of the body were separated. And the focus was to make the worker's actions as mechanical, as predictable, and efficient as possible, to make the worker an extension of the machine. So to do this, industrial engineers and managers have to monitor workers, figuring out the simple, repetitive jobs a worker could do, and then ensuring that they do it as efficiently as possible. And the end result is the mass manufacturing of homogeneous products by regimenting production in particular ways, which is a de-skilling of industrial labor and, in the name of scientific efficiency, an increase in a specific type of mind-numbing and often back-breaking work. Well, Gramsci, as far as I can tell, is the one who first coined the idea of Fordist capitalism. And he suggests that the efficiency that's promised by the mechanized Fordist factory labor also creates risks that require an accompanying moralizing standardization. Okay, so what is he saying? He argues that the more efficient the worker, the more mechanical the worker's motions, the more the worker can think whatever they want. So disciplining the body, according to Gramsci, has the potential to free the mind, a possibility that it was in capitalists' best interest to prevent by creating new subjects, by encouraging consumption of standardized goods as markers of individuality, and developing morally restrictive codes of behavior, including an emphasis on prohibition and sexual restraint. Okay, so even in the original moments of Fordism, when Ford is trying to standardize production, how this affects consumers and consumers' understandings of their relationship to objects is very much an issue. Standardization was not just standardization of production, it is also standardization of the practices surrounding objects and circulations. So companies, schools, government offices were all invested in promoting this ethos of mechanical and social standardized practices. And they were engaging in a number of pedagogical practices whenever a new technology is introduced, from stereographs to telephones. So this is to kind of remind you what stereographs are. This is the ViewMaster that some of you may know people who have used ViewMasters. And this is what the ViewMaster comes from, the stereograph that was circulating began circulating in the 1920s and 1930s. Now, the companies who were producing stereographs were also producing at the same time manuals for schools, which instructed teachers to pay very careful attention to precisely how students sat and peered through early forms of viewfinders to experience this early version of the 3D photographs, right? And when telephones were introduced, companies also were deeply concerned about how people's participations have to be altered, allowing many more people as passive and unseen observers on conversations that for them seemed to be a risk. So Cloud Fisher, a US historian of the telephone, writes about how telephone companies in the 1910s and 1930s was deeply concerned with teaching party line etiquette. They told people not to eavesdrop and not to occupy the line with long conversations. They had telephone operators intervene in case someone wanted to have a band rehearsal over the party line because one household happened to have a ukulele and another household happened to have someone with a really good baritone. They were also sending talkative customers warning letters telling them that they shouldn't be talking so much. So here the technology is creating new actors and new connections, right? So first, a party line requires several households to share a single telephone line, thus allowing single individuals from a household to join or overhear conversations taking place on the line. And second, companies expected telephone operators to monitor party lines to prevent talkative people, who are often understood to be women, from dominating this shared medium. So telephone operators, almost all of whom were also women, had an assigned role of monitoring as a company representative. The telephone line allowed not only new, primarily silent participants into conversations, but also a new type of participant, the operator, to engage in these conversations and assist in standardizing practices. And of course, as many of you know, companies decided that it was their responsibility to tell people what should be said when you first pick up the phone, right? Because this becomes a problem. You have to indicate to the person on the other line that you are present, right? So Edison wanted everyone to say hello, and Graham Bell wanted everyone to say ahoy. Edison's company wins this game of persuasion, though we can still see lingering traces of allegiances to Bell's vision in the way that, let's say, Mr. Burns still answers the phone in The Simpsons. So let me see if I can call that up more quickly.
Ahoy, hoy.
Okay, so this is an example of the Fordist form of standardization. And it's a Fordist form of standardization around newly introduced technologies, large-scale pedagogical projects by companies and governments and schools to ensure that everyone is using technologies in the same way, even though people like Mr. Burns might escape. But I want to turn now to neoliberalism, right, which I'm using to represented by Reagan and Thatcher. And I have to say here, as I kind of began saying at the beginning of my talk, I'm very sympathetic for people in academic circles who hear neoliberalism bandied about too much. So I'm very committed to talking about neoliberalism with a bit more historical precision. And if any of you want to ask me questions about this afterwards, boy, do I have long rants about this. So I'm following Phil Moravsky's work, and I want to attend to how Frederick Hayek, Milton Friedman, and others created a network of scholars and universities, governments, and think tanks that were promoting neoliberal principles. So let me give you the shortest version of what they were promoting that I can. One such basic neoliberal principle is that the market is a universal construct that produces the most ideal form of spontaneous order. And it produces the most ideal form in part because humans are too limited. They're too limited to ever adequately know enough to do centralized economic planning. And so if this is true, then market solutions are the best way to find a solution for any social problem. And one should always privatize because that allows you to find the market solution for these problems. State governments can be useful. He doesn't want to get rid of this government entirely, but they're useful only to create the most market-friendly environments possible. And a global universal market is always preferable to many national ones. Okay. So under contemporary forms of neoliberalism, it turns out there isn't the same emphasis on everyone using technologies in the same way. In fact, it's just the opposite. Companies are often encouraging users to use technologies in their own distinctive way so that users feel like they are deeply invested in the media. And the equivalent of telephone operators still can accompany new media, but only as invisible actors making decisions according to a logic of standards that, when they exist, are purposely kept secret. Okay, let me give you a very clear example of what that means. In early February 2012, the Gawker website posted a leaked copy of Facebook's operation manual for content managers. So apparently, Facebook had been outsourcing censoring the posted content to companies like Odesk, who hired workers in Morocco and the Philippines to look at thousands of photographs for $1 a day, kind of looking at the sewer of Facebook to figure out which photographs should be censored or not. Now, these underpaid workers were not being told that Facebook was indirectly hiring them, but it's really not hard for them to figure this out, right? So a frustrated Moroccan employee gave the manual he had been given by Odesk, produced by Facebook, that was supposed to help him determine whether a particular photograph was acceptable or not. Now, Facebook does claim to have community standards on its website, but it turns out they're much vaguer than anything that was in the manual. So at the time, this is 2012, the community standards available on Facebook for anyone with internet access to see explained, let me quote, as a trusted community of friends, family, coworkers, and classmates, Facebook is largely self-regulated. People who use Facebook can and do report content that they find questionable and offensive. We have a strict no nudity or pornography policy. Any content that is inappropriately sexual will be removed. Before posting questionable content, be mindful of the consequences for you and your environment. End quote. Okay, so what the operation manual tells content managers is forbidden, however, is much more details. So they say to them that images of any obvious sexual activity, even if naked parts are hidden from view by hands, clothes, or other objects. And the manual continues to provide 11 more entries about what might count as a violation of standards. So if you only read what Facebook says online about its standards, you would not know that maps of Kurdistan were unwelcome. And it turns out that also images of earwax was unwelcome, whether real or animated and turned into cartoon form. But it turns out that images of real and cartoon snot are completely acceptable, right? So in short, as a corporation, Facebook may have to employ content managers to protect its image, its brand, but as a neoliberal company, it's not in the business of openly instructing users about how best to use Facebook. Now, there's a really interesting exception for this, which has been in the news lately because of how it affects drag queens, right? Facebook wants online profiles to represent offline people. But I'm taking this to be an exception that supports my larger argument that companies have changed the ways in which they encourage standardized media practices as they follow neoliberal principles. After all, companies are focusing more on treating information as a commodity, which directly comes out of a Hayekian understanding of what the market can do. And thus, they're focusing more on intellectual property and privacy rights. So when Facebook insists in their statement of rights and responsibilities that users provide their real names and information and do not, quote, provide any false personal information on Facebook or create an account for anyone other than yourself without permission, end quote, the company is doing more than simply encouraging a media ideology in which people are supposed to have only one coherent identity across a range of media. Facebook is requiring people to provide information that can be, and all of you realize this, most effectively data mined and turned into profit when they are selling it to other corporations, right? Because after all, what does an advertising company want with detailed profiles of the kinds of movies 1,000 Frodo and Bilbo Baggins like to watch, right? This is not going to be useful for them. So when Facebook and other social media corporations try to regulate people's media practices nowadays, it's largely in the interest of gleaning information that can be most effectively and smoothly sold to other people. So of the 49 posted rights and responsibilities for users in 2012, 36 of those involved intellectual property or commodified information in some form or another. So standardization, when it is happening nowadays, tends to be a standardization in response to a neoliberal construction of a dilemma, to protect a brand or to ensure that information is accurate enough to have value for marketers. So this is not to say that all forms of overt Fordist standardization have gone away, right? So movie theaters still instruct viewers how to watch movies, to turn off cell phones and so on. So what I'm suggesting that was a way of taking an older form of media and standardization around how you are supposed to engage with that media and trying to use it to structure the ways in which people are now using more newly introduced media, right? But what it means is that we have been surrounded by media with different histories of standardization now for quite a while. And it isn't that big of a stretch for people to assume that the etiquette of the Fordist etiquette does in fact exist, regardless of how new the media might be, or what the actual efforts to standardize what that medium's use might be. Yet historical changes in how etiquette around new media becomes widespread sometimes means that there aren't actually well-known or uniform rules for how to use some media. And this can create a very uncomfortable ambiguity for users, especially when these new technologies are part of looking for a job, where you are assuming that they're going to be well-defined rules for how you are supposed to use a medium, let's say like LinkedIn, and yet the company is obeying different ways of instituting these well-known standards. Now, LinkedIn as a company provides some guidelines for how the company would like to have the widespread etiquette for using this media, and it does so more than any other social media site. But LinkedIn as a company does not necessarily know about all the attempts at standardizing its use. That is, while there are a number of attempts to standardize how people use LinkedIn, these are not necessarily coordinated efforts. So I realized this while I met with members of LinkedIn's user experience group. So I mentioned to them that some of my research involved attending LinkedIn workshops in the area, teaching job seekers how to craft their LinkedIn profile. They were surprised to find out that these workshops existed, and in many cases only 5 or 10 miles from where they worked at the company headquarters. But I have to say, I was really surprised that they were surprised, because this had been most of my research, was going to all these how to use LinkedIn, kind of LinkedIn 1, LinkedIn 2. There were different levels of the workshops that existed, and many of these places had been doing so since late 2008, just soon after the Wall Street crash. So the LinkedIn employees, when I told them that this was happening, immediately began wondering if there was anything they could do to help clarify how LinkedIn should be used. And so they started saying, well, maybe we can tweak the interface, or maybe we can publish more explanatory articles on LinkedIn. But no one suggested coordinating with the people who were creating these workshops. No one suggested going to job organizations and starting to talk to them about how they were instructing this. So I left the meeting wondering what was going to happen. Would LinkedIn employees remain committed to this belief that online design decisions and articles would be enough to shape how people come up with rules for using the media? Because it's one thing to come up with rules for using a new medium. It is another thing entirely to convince everyone that your rules are the ones that should be followed. So LinkedIn as a company tends to focus its efforts on, I'm just going to leave this as a blank marker. LinkedIn as a company tends to focus its efforts at standardizing users' practices to the way it designs to the ways it designs its interface, and to making advice available online or in offline publications. Like Facebook and other sites, it encourages users to fill out their profile as much as possible. Yet the LinkedIn takes this a step further, often showing a circle that is gradually filled to indicate the ways in which someone can have a profile operating at full strength. Right? I don't know if you guys have seen the ways in which this kind of is encouraging you to have a particular graphic to fill it in a certain way. So this graphic can encourage people to fill in as much information as they can on their profiles, which is an effective strategy for creating a certain degree of standardized use. But I saw this strategy of LinkedIn in action one day when I was observing Ruth, who is a career counselor, and she's offering a free consultation to Gina, which she was doing for anyone who wanted to improve their LinkedIn profile. So they were sitting down, looking at Gina's LinkedIn profile and talking about how to make it better. So Gina's first concern is, how should she fill out the portion of the LinkedIn profile in which she describes her job title? She's unemployed, and so she has no job title, and so this is immediately confusing for her. But as she pointed out, in order to have the LinkedIn strength meter confirm that her profile was at an all-star status, the LinkedIn terminology, she needed to fill out this section. Ruth, the career counselor, thought that Gina should not take the LinkedIn strength meter all that seriously and tried to gently suggest this to her. Ruth suggested that Gina should put down something in that space if she found it comforting, but only if she found it comforting, and recommended that she put down, I'm sure you're all guessing exactly what she's going to put down, actively seeking opportunities in a specific professional field, which in Gina's case is biotech product management. Now, these are precisely the conversations by which many social media standards get established. The interface encourages the user to behave in one way. The technology has an implied user that would fill out the profile entirely. But the actual user's circumstances doesn't allow her to easily or comfortably accede to this suggestion. Perhaps the actual user doesn't have a job title. This is but one of the ways in which the LinkedIn interface tends to presume that its users have jobs. Or in another case, Don didn't want to indicate what year he graduated from college, in case that marked Don as too old to participate effectively in a particular job market. So the actual users check with friends, they check with coworkers, or they check with a local career counselor to see how to finesse the gap between the implied user and the actual user's context and practical concerns. And as they do this, they come up with solutions that feel appropriate for that particular community of practice. And over time, this can turn into an agreed upon etiquette for people who are all in a certain profession or a certain region of the country or a certain class background. Even when LinkedIn's interface strongly recommends a standardized practice, there's no guarantee that the users will comply unless it makes sense in terms of how the government communicates, in terms of how their group communicates about jobs and employment already. So I've been arguing that different ways of organizing markets inspire different techniques of standardization, from top-down pedagogical practices and manuals to secretive monitoring and designs that imply appropriate use. At the same time, these different forms also cause people to focus on different practices to standardize, from Fordist attention to homogeneous products and homogeneous efficient practices to neoliberals' emphasis on information as a commodity. So now when I'm turning again to LinkedIn, I want to talk about the standardizing practices around LinkedIn that are also standardizing ideas about what it means to be employable in a specifically neoliberal way. Okay, so to condense a much longer rant that I have inside of me, being employable nowadays means thinking of yourself as a business, as a bundle of skills, assets, experiences, qualities, and relationships that you are managing and constantly having to enhance. When you're employed, you are, as a result of this metaphor, entering into a business-to-business alliance, a temporary contract in which you are supposedly offering market-specific solutions to the business's perceived problems. LinkedIn allows you to display yourself as a business. It is a marketing document in which you present yourself as a bundle of unweighted skills, endorsements, unweighted relationships, connections, and experiences. This is a bundle that LinkedIn would like users to believe they must constantly manage and enhance. They want them to be constantly interacting with the site, especially since social media companies measure their success to a certain degree by how often they're used. So part of the second order information that the LinkedIn interface reveals is how effective users are at adopting this model of the self, of presenting themselves as an ever-expanding, business-like bundle of skills, experiences, and connections. At the same time, users' struggles with LinkedIn also reveal some of the problems that emerge when you're trying to implement this self-as-business model. One of the major tensions that I kept seeing that I see happening under neoliberal capitalism is between standardization and context, between creating something that travels smoothly through as many different contexts as possible and acknowledging how local the context is in imbuing value and meaning. So of course, this problem exists in earlier forms of capitalism, not saying it doesn't, but it has a particular spin and is exasperated in particular ways under neoliberalism. The problem underlies most of the dilemmas that people have when adopting LinkedIn. So let me give you a concrete example. Part of what LinkedIn offers is a way to connect with people solely on the basis of the fact that the two of you were part of the same organization at some point or another, that you worked for the same company, or you graduated from the same college, or were part of the same sorority. But what does this commonality actually indicate? So one recent college graduate that I interviewed told me how difficult she found it to connect with others who had been a member of her sorority on another campus. Okay, so I have to say, I was really surprised by this. Like, sororities are precisely supposed to be the organization where this works really well. And so I asked her, why can't you use sororities for creating the networking ties that you're supposed to want to create for your job search? And she said, well, but every sorority has its own character on a college campus. And the reputation of a sorority might be specific to that campus. And here I'm going to quote, with different sororities from campus to campus, they could be a top house there and just a really weird house there. It kind of varies. And so to say that I would have a connection with this woman because she's in my sorority doesn't mean anything. And then she continued to explain how in some campuses, people in her sorority were considered real sluts, and in others they weren't. And so she wasn't quite sure what that connection would indicate. So here's a question of what kind of tacit information is conveyed when she connects with a sorority member. What stereotype might she be unwittingly engaging with? So this may seem like a problem that's only connected to fraternities or sororities, but companies, offices in different parts of the country also have their own workplace-specific dynamics, as do international branches. So being hired to be part of PayPal in the United States might signal something very different than being a part of PayPal in Spain. And for that matter, a recruiter explained to me that the years that you were hired at a particular company might also convey additional information to others. She said that one company in the Silicon Valley was notorious for having made terrible, terrible hiring decisions between 2002 and 2005. If you'd been hired at the company beforehand, other companies would be very happy to poach you. But being hired during the bad years of hiring at that company would be a mark against you, even though working for that company in general would not be. So institutional reputations from sororities to corporations can be complex, and they often require considerable background knowledge. So while LinkedIn offers a way to search for people who at some point or another have all participated in similar institutions, it turns out that how similar these institutions are in practice might be crucial and are often kind of worryingly unknown for people as they're deciding to connect and exchange with each other. Well, endorsements are a feature of LinkedIn that also manages to condense many of the social quandaries that this new participant structure is offering for users. So users are asked by LinkedIn to endorse each other's skills by clicking on the button to affirm that, say, Robert is a good public speaker. And endorsements, it turns out, were an adaptation of a trending database that LinkedIn offered so that users could figure out which skills were most popular in the jobs that they were interested in that month. They could track how the mention of certain words increased or decreased. And in 2012, LinkedIn decided to transform this skill database into a lightweight recommendation system, these one-click endorsements. They provide an unqualified positive affirmation of people's skills. There's no way to discuss how good you are at something. You just can talk about how the fact that you can do it. So I might be able to create a PowerPoint presentation, but not make, let's face it, very compelling or memorable PowerPoints. But on LinkedIn, people can only testify that I can, in fact, produce a PowerPoint presentation when called upon to do so. But the endorsements don't allow people to nuance this claim. So I could be a PowerPoint drudge, or I could be a PowerPoint grandmaster, which I clearly am not. And LinkedIn endorsements can only signal the presence of a skill, not anything more than that. Anyone can endorse a profile for a skill. So Tony explained to me with great energy how frustrated he was by his well-meaning relatives who kept endorsing him for skills on LinkedIn. So his Aunt Mary was really, really worried about him, and she kept endorsing him on LinkedIn, even though she had absolutely no idea what he did as a product engineer or what the skills actually referred to. And Tony wanted endorsements to be legitimate. He believed that the people clicking an affirmation that someone possesses a certain skill should have some previous knowledge of the ways that people demonstrated the skill. So Tony kept having to monitor his LinkedIn profile, and he kept deleting endorsements, and especially Aunt Mary's endorsements, because she wasn't signaling substantive knowledge. So for many people, endorsements can seem a bit suspect. A signal, yes, but a pretty fuzzy one, and not necessarily accepted as a legitimate one. Well, some people also are using endorsements just to spread goodwill in the world. And in one of the job organizations that I was part of, Luke was notorious, it turns out, for endorsing absolutely everyone. Now, he explained to me that he really meant to do this, right? He endorses everyone that LinkedIn suggests he endorses, operating by the philosophy that he should accept people at face value unless he was actively forced to confront their absolute lack of ability. Of course, this is LinkedIn's assertion of face value, not something that people themselves were actually claiming. So Luke explained to me the logic he used to decide whether to endorse people, because I have to admit, he endorsed me before I actually interviewed him. So I met him at a job-seeking organization. I said, "Oh, you seem like a likely person for me to interview. Can I buy you a cup of coffee and talk to you about this?" I get home, he has a LinkedIn request. I obviously am connecting because I am desperate to interview as many people as I can. And he suddenly starts endorsing me for things. He's the only person who did this in my fieldwork. And so in the interview, I said, "Well, it's really interesting to me that you've begun endorsing me for things. Why are you doing this?" And he says, "Well, my basic philosophy is you put your hand out to shake hands. I'm going to shake your hand. I'm certainly not going to bite it off. So to me, endorsements are like that. I'll give out endorsements freely to people. You tell me that you're an experienced professor in anthropology. I believe you. Okay, you're an honest, good person. You tell me that you're ethical. I believe you. And that's what endorsements are like to me." So what Luke would get on LinkedIn every day, and he would spend 10 or 15 minutes just endorsing the people that LinkedIn recommended in his attempt to spread goodwill. But as I was saying, Luke was such a prolific endorser in job-seeking circles that people would occasionally mention him to me as an endorser gone wild. So Will, a job seeker, mentioned, "I ran into him last Saturday," and he goes, "Excuse me, have we met?" I'm like, "You endorsed me 5 times." Now, in this instance, neither Will nor Luke think that endorsements are consequential. Right? But Luke sees the endorsement as fundamentally about reminding people of your goodwill towards them. And Will was amused that Luke's use of endorsements didn't mean that Luke was actually going to experience the goodwill enough to remember him from one endorsement moment to another. Well, the LinkedIn version of the self as business is constantly erring on the side of being context-free. So you can see this in the way that endorsements are unequivocal. You either have a skill or you don't, but how you learned the skill, when you demonstrated it, and to what degree you might possess it, all of these things are unknowns to anyone trying to interpret your LinkedIn endorsement section. And it's the same with LinkedIn connections. It's unclear to anyone looking at a profile how well the profile user knows the people they are connected to. And this leads to many etiquette issues for users when they're dealing with a genre that tends to signal quantity instead of quality. And issues that kind of particularly arise when you're looking for a job and you're trying to figure out, can this person connect me to this other person? And you don't know what the strength of that tie actually is. So as LinkedIn provides a model for representing yourself as a business, it errs on the side of being more of a marketing document than an evaluation, enabling formulaic ways of expressing yourself as a bundle instead of enabling you to provide nuanced context. Okay, so I want to conclude. So in conclusion, job searching is a social task that in the United States is so highly charged that people often worry if there is a clearly defined right or wrong way when they are communicating with a potential employer. As a result, LinkedIn, more than many of the recently introduced media these days, becomes a magnet for pedagogical efforts to standardize how people use LinkedIn. You're supposed to bring to your LinkedIn profile the same talent for being read as unique in just the right way. That is, you cannot be unique like a crazy cat lady is unique, but you have to be unique in a homogeneous and standardized form that demonstrates that you know how to be competent at these kinds of standardizing and standardized genres. Figuring out how to do this becomes the lived dilemma that many LinkedIn users are encountering as they try to figure out how do you really use LinkedIn. But at the same time, I've been suggesting throughout that LinkedIn is also calling upon users to adhere to a more standardized understanding of the self, to think of everyone more and more as though they are a business, and every social interaction as potentially a market interaction, with the same kind of potential for instrumental interaction and kind of use value in that way. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Ilana. Questions?
Hi, thanks for that. That was really great. So I think a lot. One of the questions I guess I have for you is about, is there any potential for subversion within LinkedIn? This is something like within other platforms, like, I mean, because I love weird Twitter, and I've been like, I really want there to be weird LinkedIn. Like, and endorsement bombing is kind of like the closest thing you maybe get, but I think like right now my LinkedIn profile is like a cup of dry ice, and I've like tried to find like witches and stuff, but it's like there actually are professional witches using LinkedIn in like a very legible way. And I can't find, and maybe it's like super underground and I just can't find the real weird LinkedIn, but like where or if, is it like, is there even like a space, like, and have you encountered anything that kind of suggests that there's any kind of pushback or like that kind of like community or culture potential within that platform?
Yeah. So, boy, do I wish I could find weird LinkedIn. And if you come across it, please let me know. So let me say, there are reasons why I would be unlikely to come across it, right? Because my fieldwork was interviewing people who were anxious about finding a job, or who were trying to use LinkedIn as a way to find reasonable employees that they wanted to hire, right? And this kind of moment of tension is the least likely moment where you are going to be interesting in the way that you're talking about. So the only moment I found that had any potential for this, and I really would have wanted to find it, was that there was I was doing this research in the Bay Area, which meant that I was also doing this research with a lot of people who were in Silicon Valley. It wasn't always a one-to-one connection. And some of these companies have weird job titles. And so one of the signals that you were actually looking to leave and you were trying to get another job was that you changed your job title from, let's say, flight leader to something that was more legible on LinkedIn. And that's the only really quirky moment. I mean, this is like, I started off saying LinkedIn is kind of boring to interview people about. It's precisely for what you're talking about. But if, like, we should all leave and try to figure out a way to do this with LinkedIn.
Hi, I'm Dahlia. I actually found my current job on LinkedIn. They found me. So
Yes.
sometimes, and I work in media, and I work with standards, but in a totally different way. So my question was, it really piqued my interest that the UX team at LinkedIn was surprised by your research. So did you ever follow up with them, and what did you find?
No, I didn't follow up with them. And so, yeah, no, I mean, I didn't end up doing that. Maybe when my book comes out, they'll want to talk to me. I really just don't know. I couldn't, I mean, it was a user experience conversation where we were both trying to figure out how to make the other person interesting and useful. I mean, do you know, you have those conversations where you're not quite sure what's going on? And I found what they were saying and how they were responding to things that I was saying to them really interesting, but they didn't seem to have any idea how to take what I was doing and make it useful for themselves. So there may be reasons why. I mean, it may be just my presentation style, like, or whatever I was doing just wasn't working. Yeah.
Oh, hi. Yeah, I'm wondering how different generations or different groups use LinkedIn. I mean, I feel like I was the pre-LinkedIn generation, and yet I was with a bunch of students, and we went to NBC and talked to a recruiter, and he was really interesting because he said to them, look, you know, for us old people, and I think he was in his late 50s to mid 60s, LinkedIn is the old school media that we understand. So all the rest of the social stuff, I'm glad you're on it, but I'm not going to find you there, but I am going to find you on LinkedIn. And I just started wondering about, you know, the different, I mean, because I'm in my 50s, so,
Right.
But here's someone who's older than I am saying that, you know, LinkedIn is the old school recruiting method.
Well, I think LinkedIn is a fabulous it's a fabulous recruiter's database, right? And this is how people are using LinkedIn. But I don't know. I really appreciate this person's media ideology and kind of how they understand it, but this didn't actually map onto what I was seeing in my fieldwork, right? So that I was interviewing I mainly was interviewing people who were between 45 and 60 and who were learning how to use LinkedIn and trying to figure out how to use it to connect for to find jobs. And then I interviewed other people who, I did interview quite a number of people who were from a different generation, who were younger. And everybody seemed to be talking about using LinkedIn in very similar ways, as this is the professional space that is very different than the other media that they're using, and they were also struggling to figure out whether the ways in which they chose who to connect with on Facebook should be the same kind of calculations for how they were going to use LinkedIn, but they weren't necessarily imagining it as anything other than a professional space to make contacts so that they could have a stable Rolodex.
I guess my question is more because my students were not on LinkedIn,
Yeah.
and they were sort of shocked to hear that, and that they should be on LinkedIn, and they were defining it as an older person's space. So I'm just wondering if it's kind of a net with a hole on both sides, where, you know, younger people are not necessarily getting on it as much anymore, or is there sort of a post-LinkedIn world?
So LinkedIn is a social media that people are being told if they are looking for white-collar jobs, they should be on LinkedIn. They shouldn't be using LinkedIn to necessarily connect with friends, but they should be using it as a stable point as they move from job to continue being in contact with people who are also moving from job to job and who they don't know well enough to have exchanged phone numbers, right? So I imagine that it's taking a particular place in work life and in professional life. And if your students are not on LinkedIn, it's because they're not engaging with work life in that particular way. And and it may not be about generation as it is about people who are accepting when they're being told this is how you should use LinkedIn, they then adopt it in that way.
Yeah, although they are engaging in work life. I mean,
Right.
Yeah, so.
But maybe, and maybe they realize that LinkedIn isn't doing the work for them that they want. Right.
Before I'm going to take speaker's prerogative for a second.
Great.
So one of the things I'm struck by and struggling with, as you talk about it as marketing rhetoric and position it within neoliberal ideologies, it puts the position on the individual to gain knowledge, the individual to have power, the individual to understand their subject position and their ability to market themselves. Yet, one of the things that I continuously see in how this tool is actually employed by employers is that it's all about understanding individuals within a network and a structure. And you mentioned
Yeah.
this with regard to understanding when they're hired at a particular company and what that looks like. But it's also within one's social structure, one's network structure, which is to say that if you don't know the right people, you're not going to get the job. And in the classic form of household torment that some of you know about, I decided that when my partner was looking for a job, that I would make him do a whole set of experiments for me. And one of them was actually tracking the data of who all looked at his LinkedIn,
Yeah.
and tracking all of the different requests that he was getting from both headhunters and different people within the company. And what came to being in this process was that a series of white-collar jobs that he was applying to, these were high-tech, were actually asking him and trying to identify everybody he knew at the company in order to find out if he was already like the company. And if he was already like the company, he
Right.
would get the calls. And if he wasn't already like the company, he wouldn't get the calls. And, you know, he is a relatively privileged individual who's white and male.
Right.
And so what does this mean when we start talking about people who may have the skills, may have the know-how, but don't have the structural position to actually be able to get in there because they don't signal the right things?
Right.
So how do you deal with the inequalities, or what are you seeing with regard to the inequalities across this, particularly as I think about, you know, the explicit racism that is already undergoing in a lot of these hiring practices?
So yes, I mean, I think you're absolutely right that this is part of what's happening, is that LinkedIn offers a way to make this idea of network explicit, and for other and for employers, people think that it is measurable, right? That they can see these connections and then say, that people have these many number of connections. These are the people they're connected to. I can understand whether they have cultural fit or not. And cultural fit is becoming the language that people are using to express the kinds of racism and structured inequalities. In the hiring process, you say, oh, I'm not sure this person is a good fit. And what that means is ambiguous enough that you can smuggle in anything like racism, ageism, and kind of all these prejudices. So I think you're right that LinkedIn offers this kind of lens and allows you to perpetuate that if you want to.
Well, and then the question is, what's the mechanisms of resistance?
Yeah.
Yeah, so I'm wondering what, if anything, you heard from employers about how they think about this tool, and specifically how they think about the kind of standardized self that LinkedIn is encouraging people to form on this tool, because it seems to me there's a tension because on the one hand, the users are kind of being encouraged to put their experiences and all these things in these boxes and make it look the way it's supposed to look. But then there's also, you know, now we know that a lot of employers kind of would look at something like that and be like, well, that's not the real person. Like, I'm going to Google them. I'm going to look at their
Yes.
I'm kind of going to try to get around the standardized that self and see what's like really there. And did you see that tension kind of coming out in your field work?
Yes, no. This is one of the major tensions with LinkedIn. Thank you for asking that. It wasn't something that I talked about in this talk, but I do think about it a lot, which is how LinkedIn fits in with all the representations that you are supposed to produce as an employable self is a major tension, right? So people talked a lot about when the LinkedIn profile fit in with the resume or not, and then also didn't use LinkedIn as a kind of indicator of the authentic self necessarily. Yeah. Though they may have been using the connections that you are able to do with LinkedIn as more of an indicator of authenticity. So yeah, I mean, people—
Which you arguably have less control over as
right.
the user, yeah.
Well, who you don't connect to may be revealing.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right that LinkedIn was, especially for employers, also understood to be a marketing document that they weren't always sure. They tended not to read endorsements. Recommendations, they weren't always sure how to evaluate, and some tended to evaluate more strongly than others. But I think this is in fact precisely the tension point, is that a LinkedIn profile is part of one genre among a range of genres. And what they were worried about is when it wasn't consistent and coherent, that's when they really began to worry, that you had to have a kind of a consistent narrative. And so if the resume and the profile didn't match in particular ways that they were interpreting, they would then kind of say, oh, this may be a problem. We need to either look forward or toss this person out of the applicant pile. Yeah.
Right. So I guess following up on both of these last two questions, I guess I was particularly interested in thinking about how certain structural inequalities are perpetuated precisely through the kind of fake transparency that LinkedIn seems to present. So kind of thinking about how your kind of what is characteristic neoliberal about LinkedIn, right? Like, why is LinkedIn a technology that we want to like use to think about neoliberalism? I guess what strikes me is like how much LinkedIn presents itself in a way as like you can control this and you know, look, you can market yourself, but in fact, the network is what matters, and that is only limited in your control. So it's sort of like much of the technology around us like presents a kind of agency which in fact like hinders agency. So I guess I'm just sort of thinking about that, and if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, so one of the things that I also found really interesting, and this is slightly tangential to what you're saying, but one of the things that I found interesting about job seekers talking about using LinkedIn in particular is that LinkedIn for them was a constant experience of how they didn't have agency, precisely because of the ways in which it demonstrated the network for them. So one of the interesting things is when you're using the social media, you are at the center of the network, right? The network is kind of projected out from you, but what the users were that I was talking to, were the job seekers that I was talking to were experiencing is that for them, the hiring manager, and I can talk to you about kind of like how problematic it is to imagine the hiring manager as one person, but the hiring manager was for them the fetishized center of the network. And they were trying to understand how they could connect to the hiring manager and constantly seeing themselves as not being at the center of the network, or that the connections that they had were too weak or too inept to be able to mobilize to get them to the center. So this was like, even though the interface was encouraging them to experience this as particularly agentive, they were constantly talking to me about how clear it was for them that they were not. Right? And they kept trying to kind of think, well, if I use this link, is this too weak a link? Kind of what connection can get me to that point? So, yeah.
I was just curious, to what extent did anybody you interview use the language of self-branding to describe how they used LinkedIn? Just because you mentioned as the boring platform compared to others, and I feel like most other social media platforms, the language of self-branding and the design for self-branding seems to have dominated in recent years. But does that work with LinkedIn? Is that how people express themselves on LinkedIn?
Yes. Yeah, so I was kind of, I was tracking branding language a lot too, because of course the idea of self-branding is something that also is comes out of this neoliberal self. What they were really concerned about, I mean, yes, they would talk about LinkedIn as a space for them to express their brand, but they were really, whenever the branding language came up, it was always about being coherent across a range of social media and making sure that your LinkedIn profile didn't contradict your Twitter and didn't contradict your Facebook, and being as consistent with making sure that the 3 or 4 words that you have chosen to be the kind of the core of your brand is getting reflected in all those moments. So they were worried about inconsistency quite a bit. Yeah.
So I had a question. This goes in probably to what you were just mentioning about the loss of agency, but did you encounter any populations or any instances where there was almost resistance, or just active being like, I'm not going to do this, I'm not going to be a part of this like this pressure? And I'm just seeing, if there's any chance for like this idea that it's inevitable almost. It seems that everyone looked at LinkedIn as an inevitability, that they had to be on it. And I'm curious if there were instances where there was an alternative.
So I got a lot more when I was talking to people about Facebook. Many more people were happy to talk to me about deactivating Facebook. I found 2 people who were not using LinkedIn, and one person picked it up again after like 2 months after I interviewed her. The one person who I tracked down and interviewed because I had heard through a grapevine that he didn't use LinkedIn was really interesting in talking about why he didn't use LinkedIn. So that was the whole reason why we were having coffee. It was very clear. And he said, well, I don't like LinkedIn because it doesn't give me enough for my data. It uses my data and then I'm not getting anything from it. So I asked him, well, what do you think of GitHub or Stack Overflow? And he's like, yes, they give me enough for my data. They're fabulous. And so what was really interesting was that he was thinking of himself in the ways that data scientists would talk to me about kind of the information that they were getting. And he was judging who is worthy and who is giving enough for me in this exchange relationship. So, but I do have to say, whether people wanted to use LinkedIn or not, most people were constantly being told, in order to get a job, you absolutely must do this, even though I'm still completely uncertain about whether that is actually the case or not.
I've gotten leads through LinkedIn, and some of them have actually been monetized. So I'm actually very happy with the return that I get.
Yeah.
And most of the people, I'm 64 years old, and most of the people that in my network are much younger than me.
Yeah.
And they're in their 20s and 30s, and they're on LinkedIn. They have no problem using it.
Yeah. I'm not surprised.
Any other questions? Well, I just want to say thank you, Ilana. This has been great.